Welcome, everyone, to the second episode of Identity International's second webinar series, Palestinian Beyond Conflict. This series will be running throughout the month of December on Wednesdays and Saturdays at 5 p.m. Greenwich Mean Time, where we will delve into the evolution of Palestinian identity with our esteemed guests. To receive notifications and updates regarding the series, please follow our social media platforms. And if you miss any of our episodes, please check them out on our YouTube channel. Today, we will be in conversation with Antwan Saca. Antwan was born in Jerusalem in 1984 to a Christian Palestinian family from the city of Bethlehem, and has been working for the dream of peace and justice in the Holy Land throughout his adult life. He has served as director of programs for the Holy Land Trust in Bethlehem, program coordinator at the Holy Land Christian Ecumenical Foundation, and as a research assistant in the area of urbanization and geopolitical monitoring at the Applied Research Institute in Jerusalem. He has previously served as a youth leader and a member of the One Voice movement. Antwan graduated from the Arab American University of Jenin with a bachelor's degree in public law. Antwan, thank you so much for joining us today, considering especially your internet issues, and we really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you for your time.
So my first question that I will propose to you, and it's a general theme that we have running throughout our entire series, is what does it to you personally mean to be a Palestinian?
Well, that's sort of a complex question in a way. It's the meaning for me, even to figure out what does it mean for me to be a Palestinian. What does that hold? It meant that I had to mature into the experiences I was going through as I was growing in this land, and to understand what do they mean and what do I make out of them? How do I integrate parts of those experiences into my identity? So growing up in this land, born in 1984, a time before any peace process attempt was there, before the famous Oslo Accords were signed, meant that I grew up in a city where we were under direct military control of the Israeli side. Meaning we would wake up to Israeli soldiers in our neighborhood, Israeli police, meaning that in my childhood I used to see the clashes and so on, very almost like normally on a daily basis, whether where I lived next to Bethlehem University in Bethlehem, or within the framework of my family's business that was located close to Rachel's tomb, a Jewish holy site on the entrance to Bethlehem. So what does that mean? It meant that you come to learn slowly, whether by the experiences or by the narrative surrounding you, on the experience that we're having collectively, that we come as a nation living under a military occupation, and we are continuously fighting for our independence. And so that, even as a kid, does ingrain something into your understanding of your own identity. It ingrains in a way this understanding that you actually belong into a community that is resisting. It has this nature of resisting right now in the status that it actually lives through. It means that you actually also come to realize that you are born in a community where basically collaboration in a community level is something very like expected as a minimum. So I remember in the first Intifada, the first Palestinian uprising in the 1987 onwards, people in the neighborhood and how they were helping each other, moving goods or food even from house to one house. This kind of community-oriented solidarity also becomes part of your identity. And so many things, whether it's from the childhood to adulthood to even after, the experience of also coming during my when I was young, coming to the point of witnessing the Oslo peace process being signed. In 1994, I was 10 years old, and I remember it clearly as if it was yesterday, sitting watching the TV, seeing the live broadcasts from the White House, and seeing the two leaders shaking hands and signing a peace deal. So that also, to a great extent, I would say, on a personal level, have affected my identity and my willingness, want to have that peacemaking even as part of my identity, which even if I was a kid, apparently did work out.
That's interesting, because a lot of what you mentioned is the political aspects of how the Palestine cause has been evolving throughout those years since 1984, and how much of an impact that's had on your identity. You've said in previous interviews that I've seen that the foundations of Palestinian identity is an interreligious identity. Can you comment on that?
Well, if we go not too far in history, let's say 100 years ago, you would realize that this land also was under another foreign occupation, which is the Turkish occupation. Many don't regard it as occupation. This is not the question here. But if you go into researching that era and that time specifically, you'll find that civil leaders on the ground, whether they were Muslims, Jews, or Christians, were together actually trying to resist one oppression, which is the oppression of not having self-governance, self-rule. So if you look at that era specifically, and if you look at the initial foundations of the Palestinian constitution, let's say, or attempt of constitution that was in the 30s, and the councils that were found in the 30s as a transition councils towards a state after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire and the end almost of the British rule here, you'll find that it was actually an interreligious experience. You'll find that Jews, Muslims, and Christians had a role in this intermediate momentum and at the time of writing all those laws. And so, yes, at some point, I would say Palestinians in this land, people who inhabited this land, were coming to a new experience, which is the end of the Ottoman Empire. And especially Palestinians who lived in the coastal area were so much exposed to the European experience, especially post First World War, Second World War, where they were learning about how nationalism could be formed as a collective identity, yet they were also learning of how nationalism could be a collective identity, but it should be somehow not tied to one-sided religion, because they were seeing what was happening in Europe, especially in the Second World War with Nazi German era and also others who have used religion in a way to mobilize nationalism. And so they realized they cannot do that here because this land was mixed. And also there was this attempt of wanting to have an identity that is collective, that is not tribal, based on a family, a certain family, that is not built on a religion and monarchy that is inherited. So that was the reminiscence of what we found from those experiences of the 30s. You'll find that diversity in it.
That's interesting, considering how many that try to frame the conflict, try to frame it in a religious context. And you see this both from the Israeli and the Palestinian side, especially, and the international community as well. Mm-hmm. Would you be able to comment on that from a Christian perspective as to how the narrative that sort of gets the limelight a lot of the time is this Muslim versus Jewish conflict, and it's drawn upon, you have the Crusades and you have you have a lot of ideological points that are inflicted onto the conflict, and I think to push certain narratives and certain ideological agendas. What is the Christian perspective on this?
Well, again, Christians were always part of this land. They didn't see themselves as outsiders. They didn't see themselves as people who were coming to fight for their own land as a separate land. They were part of a collective of community. So their brotherhood, sisterhood with the rest of the community meant that they also take role in this struggle. Now, this false, let's say, or unreal accusation that it is one side religion that is causing this separation is actually an illusion, and a delusion even for the reality. People did not separate here based on the religion where they lived. You'll go into cities like Jerusalem, like Hebron, and we're talking about biblical cities where they have been inhabited for thousands of years. And you'll find that there are neighborhoods that were inhabited by Jews, by Christians, by Muslims. Now, it's a human pattern that we blame it on someone else. In the Second World War, Nazi German era had an easy time blaming it on those who didn't agree with them, and specifically blaming it on the Jews. It was easier to blame than to take responsibility. So I think we're falling into the same patterns as humans today continuously, especially with the growth of Islamophobia and with the comeback of also anti-Semitism. You'll see that it's easier for people to say it's the Jews who are making the troubles, it's the Muslims who are making the conflict. And in reality, it's not. Now, we cannot deny also that religion has been used as a fuel for the conflict to maintain status quo. There are those who understand the depth and the importance and the power of the religious narratives that we hold as religious communities in this land. And when you abuse those narratives, definitely it can be something that is dangerous and not healthy for anyone. So yes, you find those bad apples, but is this a general theme for all the Muslims or all the Christians or all the Jews who live in this land? This is not the reality.
Thank you for that. And would you be able to also start, my next question would be, Palestinian Christians as a minority amongst Palestinians, statistically speaking at least, how do you feel that they maneuver currently within the Palestinian narrative?
So again, there is always this understanding, at least that I grew up within even my own community, that I didn't learn from my own first family. When I've learned it from even the extended family, the whole community, in a sense, is that we're all part of this experience. We are unified. Religion is a diversity. God's like diversity, and it shouldn't be seen as a threat. And it should be seen as something that solidifies our humanity, our wish to work for justice for all. And so in my childhood, that was the experience that I grew up within and that I was surrounded with. Now, again, slowly, things do change up from time to time with the restrictions that we've came to experience in the West Bank, where other Palestinians from other areas outside of Bethlehem, for example, for many years, they couldn't make it to Bethlehem during the Second Intifada, the Second Palestinian Uprising. We were fragmented as a society that my neighbor Muslim from Ramallah or from other areas didn't have his children or his peers or his younger brother they didn't have that experience that we grew up in, which is an experience of you see each other, you live with each other on a daily basis. So those who live in Bethlehem have a different experience than others. And so as Christians in Bethlehem, we've always seen ourselves as part of this community. We didn't see ourselves as outsiders again. We took responsibility in resisting the military occupation, just like everyone else in the land. Even if you look actually back on the founding fathers of those left-wing Palestinian fractions, you'll find actually that the majority are Christians, not Muslims. The majority of those those who founded those political social movements in the 50s, 60s, 70s, you find that they were Christians. So I've never had the experience of being separated based on that. As a Christian, for sure, my identity is important for me. There is a collective identity that I sub to as a person who was born in this land, which is a Palestinian. It is my first identity. My second identity as a Christian is important, but it's not one that does not allow me to see the beauty, the good in the other. And so I would say this is the kind of understanding, this is the kind of upbringing that the majority, if not everyone of Christians, have had in this land. And so we've never felt that we are excluded from resistance or from being punished by the military occupation. Yesterday, actually, there was an attack on the Jenin church in Jerusalem. There was an attack where there was an attempt to burn the church. And actually, the two guardians of the church who stopped the attack were actually Muslims from Jerusalem. And so, and I don't know how much you know about the churches here in general, but actually the churches are the keys of the churches, including the biggest churches here, including the Nativity Church in Bethlehem. They're held by Muslim families. The keys for those churches are held as trustees to open the churches every day by Muslim families in the land. So if you look again more and more, you'll find that there is a deeper, let's say, meltdown of those religious identities that we've experienced during the last 80 years into the holistic, bigger identity that we've come with as Palestinians.
I think it's interesting to hear about the Muslim and Christian solidarity, because I don't think you often hear about that in the mainstream either. You always hear about the factions and the separation and how divided the Palestinians are within themselves and how they are unable to come to a consensus regarding anything. But hearing about the religious solidarity is actually really important because it's a very important part of people's identity in general. Whether or not you believe in a religion or not, it shapes your culture and your outlook towards life and how you can come together as a community. So that is definitely very interesting, especially what you said about the keys in the churches. Having Muslims as the holders, and it says a lot. It says a lot about the trust that each community has from amongst each other. On that basis, what role do you believe that Palestinian identity has towards playing, has to play towards the resolution of the conflict, if you see any resolution in sight?
Well, is there resolution in sight? I'm not sure if in sight, but in general, is there resolution? For sure. It's not an impossible conflict to resolve, just to be clear.
Yes.
And the Palestinian identity and how it plays a role in resolving this conflict, you can look at it from various even times that we've went through. I grew up hearing of a very famous Palestinian poet. His name is Mahmoud Darwish, and I'm assuming the majority of who might listen know of this name. And I had to come to a point where I met one of his poems that he, of an older generation, wrote, where he described his way. And again, we're talking about a poet that is known for being one of key people who played key roles in founding our national identity. And one of his poems describes his love affair with an Israeli Jew. And when you read and understand his terms, you see this continuation of loving your enemy. He describes from his Palestinian identity how nothing separates him, nothing makes him different from Rita, his Israeli Jewish girlfriend, other than the gun. And even as a person who grew up in a Christian culture and always hearing about loving your enemy, loving your enemy, loving your enemy, as much as it made sense to me within the pretext of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, it was always hard. But to come to a point, to read a poem by one of the founding fathers of our identity, describing how he loves a human being, how he can experience love even towards that enemy, definitely that is something that I celebrate in my identity. Now, is the Palestinian identity something that has been locked into a certain understanding that we know since the beginning of time till now? No, it has been evolving. And as you said, it has evolved more and more. There were times that I would look at and say it evolved in a healthy way. And there are times that I would say it didn't evolve in a way to serve anyone, including us as Palestinians. One of the criticisms that I have towards the peace process that started in 1995 is that it had a process of reteaching Palestinians what's their identity, that it is based on a 1967 border, a political border only, where in reality, Palestinian identity has been always related to a land. It's a relation of people to land, like very similar to what you see in native communities in other places. And so to come to a place where you tell Palestinians that your identity is going to be part of it taken out, and huge part taken out of it, definitely had an impact negative on our identity as I've experienced it. That process, as I recall it, and I have contracts in my brain of what was and what came after on a civil society level, not talking politically at all. Well, for example, the role of women participation in resistance went to almost zero, almost down to less than 7%. In my childhood, I used to see women, females, leading 400, 500 of them, leading demonstrations, getting out of Bethlehem University. Again, I was living next to the university, and only 30 or 40 males in the back, because they were the ones who are in constant threat of being arrested. Right now, you don't see that. You actually see an attack some here and there if females take an active role actually in resistance. And so that only happened, in my experience, after the peace process. After the peace process and how it reshaped our identity, that it is based on a land, on a border, a certain land, a border, a statehood, and not actually maintaining our relation, our connection even to the entire land, not ownership, connection and relation to the land that we actually drove our identity from. If you look deeper and deeper into the Palestinian identity on cultural level, if you take clothes, cultural clothes, that heritage clothes that we've inherited in our community, it has on it the plants of this land, it has on it the flowers of this land. So every dress code, in a sense, was coding an area. Bethlehem had its orgithalum, Bethlehem star flower, and that is only in Bethlehem. And you would go to other areas, you'll find other flowers on the dress, you'll find other plants on the dress. So it is a relation that has been so much related to the land, so much related to the experience of being a farmer, so much related to the experience of living on the sea, on the coastal areas. So those things, I would say, right now are missing. They're not anymore the pushing factor for our identity, unfortunately. Among the new generations coming back, and I'm really happy to see that re-embracing, re-owning our identity happening, because the last 20-25 years have been so much focused on just a political identity, unfortunately.
When there's so much more to being Palestinian
Yeah.
than just the political identity. A lot of the time when you hear about what does it mean to be Palestinian, you hear a lot of the word resistance pop up a lot of the time. Resisting, the occupation, resisting Israeli forces, resisting, all sorts of forces that seem to oppress the Palestinian and the Palestinian cause in itself. How much would you say that has been a part of your identity growing up?
Sure has been, but let's make this distinction. There is a distinction between forced identity that you come to hold on yourself because that's the situation you're faced with, and an organic identity that evolves from community matureness and community experience. And I would say, as Palestinians, we haven't had that community experience that is free, that allows us to evolve our identity for more than 600 years. It's not only the last 100 years. For more than 600 years, we didn't self-govern ourselves. We didn't have that experience of self-governance. Therefore, our experience, even in allowing an organic matureness of our identity, has been always stalled, has been always pushed back, has been always faced with, let's say, even banning things or forcing things. Like if you go back into what people think about the Middle East or even this specific area, people think that we all wear hats, tarbush. This is Turkish. This is not Arab. This is Turkish. This was forced on us, actually, and it's not the heritage of Islam. So even during that time, an authentic maturing, and whether on cultural level, on whatever level you can imagine, political, making policies, whatever you can imagine, that kind of matureness, we didn't have space for it. We've not been allowed to have it. We've been having it in hidden, secret spaces among small communities who continue to ask those questions. What about us? What is about our identity in this global changing world? Where do we fall when it comes to climate change? Where do we fall when it comes to culture? Where do we fall when it comes to how do we relate to the other and who's the other? And all of those kind of policies, let's say, or matureness. We didn't have a collective space as a whole community coming at a time of peace and ease and saying, oh, this is who we are. Some minority were able to be, let's say, gatekeepers for maintaining this process. But again, it's not a wider participation of the whole community. So I would say our matureness on an identity level, other than the things that have been parachuted on us due to a reality of resisting occupation or due to a reality of living under a different culture, other than that, we haven't had really that much of time to have an organic maturing process for our identity.
And through your own work, have you been trying to implement this matureness amongst the Palestinians and your work on the ground? I mean, even the Israelis and the work that you've done with One Voice or the Holy Land Trust. How does that work? As in, what are the main objectives and what type of process is that?
So before I even work that with someone else, I had to work it with myself first.
Yeah.
I had to understand who I am, what's my chosen identity, what do I choose of values that I want to celebrate and bring into my identity as Antwan, as a Palestinian, before even talking about my partners on the Israeli side or before talking about anyone else. And therefore, yes, that has had to be an experience. And slowly, not only me, many like me who have been able to acquire those tools and skills, we've been bringing back to the community, holding spaces where we ask those questions, where we ask what's our identity? What do we want to celebrate in our day-to-day life that we want to embrace as part of our identity? What kind of tolerance, what kind of diversity, and what does it mean, tolerance and diversity in our identity? And so, yes, we've had those questions and those conversations, and we continually do those conversations internally, even not necessarily in a joint space, not necessarily with Israelis, because this is an internal matter related to us, to our growth. And I'm gonna share with you honestly, the reason that brought me to that space actually is because I wanted us to be very solidified in who we are, knowing who we are, and not wait someone else to tell us who we are and where do we belong to. And for me, this is a prerequisite for us actually going to meeting the other in the framework of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I would not encourage a Palestinian to sit in a dialogue space or in a conversation, multinational, let's say, where you're faced with many questions that you haven't experienced, like the questions of identity. And therefore, it's very important for us to have our own space as Palestinians and not to have to face those questions among Europeans and Israelis and others, because this has been the attitude for the last 20 years with all the funded projects that brought Palestinian youth to meet with peers from the other side or internationals. And therefore, no, it's time for us to have our own conversations, understand our own identity, mature within it and from it. And then those Palestinians who find a calling for actually going sitting with the enemy and actually telling the enemy that they're fed up and that they're coming in a non-violent way and to communicate their pain and anger, then they can do that, knowing who they are. And they can then maybe try and open up the eyes of those who see them only as enemies.
Is there a message that you would like to give in that, like on that note, to other Palestinians as to how you can bring them to that table and allow them to develop that sort of ability to have solidify their own identity before they do go talk to the opposition in that sense?
Well, the only message that I have about that it's not an easy process, but it's about time that we started, and it's about time that we do it. We cannot continue inheriting a gap. We need to inherit who we are, and we need to tell who we are and not continue letting others to tell who we are and decide what values we hold. And therefore, it's a must, whether it's intergenerationally or among the new generation, it's a must. And I encourage actually people to start in their own homes. Go sit down with your parents, grandparents, and ask those questions. Get to know all those questions that you've just asked me, Palestinians internally, we could be asking each other, whether on the same generation or intergenerationally. And that could be a huge resource for us to actually come to a point to really understand what is those multiple narratives, multiple stories that construct our master narrative as Palestinians.
On that note, I think we can conclude. If there are any other concluding remarks that you'd like to make, or would that be all?
Well, just one thing, again, going back to the opening that you had, which is Palestinian identity as not just being an anti-someone, and it's not just being a person under occupation. We are people who love life, seek life. Today is the celebration of lighting the Christmas tree in Bethlehem and in 4 other cities also, Bethlehem, Beit Shala, Beit Sahur, and Ramallah. And this is a festive time for us right now here in this land. And it's not only politics. Yes, we are harmed by the politics in this land. Yes, we are harmed by the situation in this land, but there are people with lives, with dreams, with visions that are not only local, that are also global and challenging global, rapidly changing world. So we are not just bunch of people who are living in a small, tiny piece of land with no connection to the outworld. We are actually people who see themselves as belonging to the global community.
No, I mean, which is a fundamental of humanity, and that's what strangely gets taken out of conflicts in the first place, is the humanity of both populations and the fact that they aren't able to be human. And people don't realize that that person is not just a statistic or not just another number to add to the number of people that have died, but they're also people that have families, they have lives, they have aspirations, and they have goals. And I mean, that's the whole point of the entire series that we're running, is to show that people in these conflicts are humans. They have their own perspective, they have their own voice, and that is what we're hoping that we can empower Palestinians with. And
I hope so.
I hope so. It's let's hope. And thank you so much for everything. That was very insightful, and it was really nice to get another perspective added to this series. So thank you for joining us today and giving us your incredible insight. And thank you to our audience for watching. Our next episode will be on Wednesday at the same time, where we will be in conversation with the renowned activist Dr. Ghada Karmi. And I would like to thank everybody on behalf of Identity International.